The rain was relentless, hammering Seattle's streets like it had a personal vendetta. Inside the cramped cafe on Pike Street, I was drowning in my own misery, feverish, shivering, and clutching a mug of chamomile tea that had gone cold. Then he walked in, and everything I thought I knew about myself started to unravel. My name is Elias Navarro, 25, a graphic designer scraping by in a city that chewed up dreamers like me. I'd been fighting a brutal flu for days, too stubborn to stay home, too broke to miss a freelance gig. That evening, I dragged myself to the Nook, a quirky cafe where I could sketch in peace and pretend I wasn't falling apart. My head throbbed, my sketchpad lay untouched, and I was seriously considering curling up under the table when the bell above the door chimed. He was soaked, his dark curls plastered to his forehead, but his grin was pure sunshine. "Mind if I steal this chair?" he asked, pointing to the empty seat across from me. His voice had this low, easy warmth, like a vinyl record spinning on a lazy Sunday. I nodded, too dazed to speak, and he slid into the seat, shaking rain from his jacket. His name, I'd learn later, was Julian Carter, 27, a barista and part-time poet who seemed to carry the weight of the world with infuriating grace. "You look like you're fighting a war in there," Julian said, nodding at my untouched tea. His hazel eyes locked onto mine, and I swear I felt my fever spike. "Just a cold," I mumbled, lying through chattering teeth. He didn't buy it. Instead, he flagged down a waitress, ordered me a fresh tea, and slid a napkin with a scribbled poem across the table. "Fever dreams, but the heart still sings." I stared at it, my chest tightening for reasons I couldn't name. Julian didn't leave. He stayed, talking about everything and nothing. His love for old jazz records, the way Seattle's rain made him feel alive, how he'd moved here from Atlanta to escape a family that didn't get him. I listened, half delirious, my walls crumbling with every word. I wasn't out, not really. Growing up in a small New Mexico town, I'd buried that part of myself under layers of denial and fear. But Julian? He was unapologetically himself, wearing his queerness like a badge of honor, and it stirred something in me I'd spent years ignoring. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Fever makes time slippery. The cafe was closing, and I was a mess, barely able to stand. "You're not walking home like this," Julian said, his tone firm but kind. Before I could protest, he was guiding me outside, his arms steadying me as rain soaked us both. We ended up at his tiny apartment a few blocks away, a cluttered haven of books and fairy lights. He tucked me into his couch with a blanket, brewed some god-awful herbal remedy, and sat beside me, reading aloud from a worn copy of Walt Whitman. I don't know when I started crying. Maybe it was the fever, maybe it was Whitman's words, or maybe it was the way Julian looked at me, like I was worth seeing. "You're okay," he whispered, brushing a stray tear from my cheek. And then, in a moment that felt like the world holding its breath, he leaned in and kissed me. It was soft, tentative, like he was asking a question I didn't know I was ready to answer. My heart stuttered, and for the first time in years, I felt alive. When I woke the next morning, my fever had broken, but that kiss lingered like a bruise, tender, impossible to ignore. Julian was gone, left for his early shift, but a note on the coffee table read, "Rest up, Elias. We've got more to talk about." I haven't stopped thinking about that soft touch since, and it terrified me. Because if I let myself feel this, if I let Julian in, what would it cost me? I spent the next week dodging him. Seattle's a big city, but it felt suffocatingly small. I'd see him at the Nook, serving coffee with that same easy grin, and I'd duck out before he could spot me. I wasn't ready to face what that kiss meant, not just for me, but for the life I'd built on lies. My family back home didn't know I was queer. Hell, I barely admitted it to myself. But every night, I'd lie awake, replaying that moment, his lips on mine, and wonder why I was running from something that felt so right. One evening, I caved and went back to the cafe. Julian was there, wiping down the counter, his expression unreadable when he saw me. "Thought you'd ghosted me for good," he said, tossing the rag aside. I stammered an apology, my voice shaking, but he just shook his head. "Elias, I'm not here to push you. But I'm not going anywhere either." He slid a fresh cup of tea my way, and we talked, really talked, for the first time since that night. He told me about his own coming out, how his family had cut him off, how he'd rebuilt his life piece by piece. I told him about New Mexico, about the expectations that had choked me for years, about the fear that kept me in the closet. It was raw, messy, and real, and by the end of it, I was crying again. Julian didn't kiss me this time. He just held my hand, his thumb tracing circles on my skin, and said, "You don't have to figure it all out tonight." But the world doesn't wait for you to figure things out. A week later, I got a call from my sister, Rosa. Our dad was sick, really sick, and she needed me home. The thought of going back to New Mexico, to that house full of secrets and silence, made my stomach churn. But I couldn't say no. I booked a flight, my heart heavy with dread, and told Julian I'd be gone for a while. His face fell, but he hugged me tight, whispering, "Come back to me, okay?" The plane ride was a blur of guilt and fear. I wasn't just leaving Julian. I was leaving the version of myself I'd only just begun to meet. Back home, the air felt thicker, the walls closer. My dad, frail and hooked to machines, barely recognized me. Rosa was a wreck, trying to hold the family together. And me? I was a coward, slipping back into the role of the dutiful son, pretending I wasn't aching for a man I'd known for less than a month. One night, after Dad was stable, I slipped out to the backyard, staring at the stars I used to wish on as a kid. My phone buzzed, Julian, texting a single line, "You're stronger than you think." I broke down, sobbing into the desert night, because I didn't feel strong. I felt like a fraud, torn between who I was and who I wanted to be. But that message, that tiny thread connecting me to Seattle, gave me something I hadn't had in years: hope. New Mexico was a time capsule, trapping me in memories I'd spent years running from. The house smelled of antiseptic and regret, and every conversation with Rosa felt like tiptoeing through a minefield. I wanted to tell her about Julian, about the kiss that had rewritten my soul, but the words stuck in my throat like broken glass. Dad's condition stabilized, but he wasn't the same. Neither was I. I'd spend days at the hospital, sketching in the waiting room to keep my hands busy, but every line I drew reminded me of Julian's poem on that napkin. I'd text him late at night, when the house was quiet and my thoughts were loud. His replies were short but steady, like a heartbeat. "Thinking of you. You got this." Each one was a lifeline, pulling me back to Seattle, to him. One afternoon, Rosa caught me staring at my phone, a stupid smile on my face. "Who's got you grinning like that?" she teased, but her eyes were sharp, searching. I froze, my heart pounding. "Just a friend," I lied, hating myself for it. She didn't push, but the silence between us felt heavier than ever. Rosa had always been my confidant, the one who knew me better than anyone. Keeping this from her was like betraying her, too. Back in Seattle, Julian was dealing with his own battles. He texted me about a poetry slam he'd performed at, how he'd poured his heart out about a stubborn artist who stole his breath. I read that message over and over, my chest aching with a mix of pride and longing. But then he mentioned his landlord hiking the rent, threatening to kick him out. I wanted to be there, to help, to do something other than send useless words across state lines. Instead, I was stuck in a hospital room, pretending to be someone I wasn't. One night, Dad woke up lucid, his eyes clearer than they'd been in weeks. "Elias," he said, his voice weak but firm, "you look like you're carrying the world." I laughed it off, but he grabbed my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Don't live for us. Live for you. His words hit like a punch, unraveling years of guilt. I wanted to tell him everything, about Julian, about the fear that kept me silent, but I couldn't. Not yet. I flew back to Seattle a week later, my heart a tangled mess of hope and dread. Julian met me at the airport, his curls wild, his grin tentative. "You're back," he said, pulling me into a hug that felt like coming home. But something was off. His eyes were tired, shadowed with worry. Over coffee at the Nook, he told me the truth. His landlord had given him a month to move out, and he was barely scraping by. "I might have to leave Seattle," he admitted, his voice breaking. The thought of losing him, after everything, was unbearable. I didn't think. I just acted. "Move in with me," I blurted. His eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought I'd overstepped. My apartment was a shoebox, barely big enough for one. But the idea of Julian leaving was worse than any cramped living situation. "You sure?" he asked, searching my face. I nodded, my throat tight. "I'm sure." Moving in together was chaos. My place was a mess of art supplies and takeout containers, and Julian's books took up half the floor. But it was our chaos, and it felt right. We'd cook terrible meals, laugh until we couldn't breathe, and fall asleep tangled together on my too small couch. Every touch, every glance, was a reminder of that first kiss, soft, vulnerable, and impossibly real. But the world doesn't let you stay in that bubble forever. A month later, I got an email from a gallery in Portland offering me a spot in a group show. It was a huge opportunity, but it meant leaving Seattle for a few weeks. Julian was supportive, pushing me to go, but I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear I felt every time I thought about losing him. "We'll make it work," he promised, kissing my forehead. I wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at me. The night before I left for Portland, we stayed up late, talking about everything we hadn't dared to before. Julian told me about his dreams of publishing a poetry collection, about the scars his family's rejection had left. I told him about New Mexico, about Dad's words, about the part of me that was still terrified of being seen. "I'm trying," I whispered, my voice raw. He cupped my face, his thumb brushing my cheek. "You're doing more than trying, Elias. You're living." Portland was a whirlwind. The gallery show was a success, and I sold a few pieces, enough to breathe easier for the first time in months. But every night, I'd call Julian, his voice grounding me across the miles. He'd read me his latest poems, each one laced with longing, and I'd sketch him from memory, trying to capture the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed. Distance made everything sharper, more urgent, like we were racing against time. Then came the call that changed everything. Rosa, her voice tight with panic, told me Dad had taken a turn for the worse. I booked the next flight back to New Mexico, my heart in my throat. Julian wanted to come with me, but I told him to stay. He couldn't afford to miss work. "I'll be there in spirit," he said, kissing me through the phone. I clung to that promise like a lifeline. New Mexico felt like stepping into a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Dad was fading fast, his breathing shallow, his hand cold in mine. Rosa and I took turns at his bedside, but the hospital's sterile hum was a constant reminder of how little time we had left. I wanted to be strong for her, for him, but all I could think about was Julian's voice, his touch, the life we were building back in Seattle. I texted him constantly, spilling my fears in fragments. "I don't know how to do this. I miss you." His replies were steady, like always. "You're not alone. I'm here." One night, when the hospital was too quiet and my thoughts too loud, he called. "Read to me." I begged, desperate for something to anchor me. He read a poem he'd written about us, about two souls finding each other in the rain. I cried silently, the phone pressed to my ear, wishing he was there to hold me. Dad passed a week later. The funeral was a blur of condolences and casseroles, small-town rituals that felt suffocating. Rosa and I clung to each other, but I felt like a ghost, drifting through a life that no longer fit. I hadn't told anyone about Julian, not even Rosa, and the weight of that secret was crushing me. At the wake, an old family friend asked if I had a girlfriend back in Seattle. I froze, the lie I'd told 100 times stuck in my throat. No, I managed, hating how it tasted. Back at the house, Rosa cornered me. "You're not yourself, Elias," she said, her eyes sharp with worry. "What's going on?" I wanted to tell her, to let it all spill out, but fear stopped me cold. Instead, I mumbled something about work stress and fled to my room. That night, I called Julian, my voice shaking. "I can't keep hiding," I said, "but I don't know how to do this." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You don't have to do it alone. I'll come to you." True to his word, Julian showed up in New Mexico 2 days later, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his grin a beacon in the desert heat. Seeing him in my childhood home, surrounded by memories of repression, was surreal. He didn't push me to talk, didn't demand answers. He just held my hand, his presence steadying me like it always did. Rosa noticed, her eyes narrowing as she watched us over dinner. "So, Julian," she said, her tone careful, "how'd you and Elias meet?" I froze, but Julian didn't miss a beat. "In a cafe, during a rainstorm," he said, his smile soft. He looked like he needed a friend. Rosa's gaze flicked to me, and I saw the pieces clicking into place. After dinner, she pulled me aside. "You love him, don't you?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. I nodded, tears burning my eyes. She hugged me, fierce and unwavering. "Then don't hide him. Not from me, not from anyone." Coming out to Rosa was like shedding a skin I'd outgrown. She didn't flinch, didn't judge, just loved me, like she always had. But the rest of the town was another story. Word spread fast, and the whispers followed. At the grocery store, at church, even at the gas station. I felt exposed, raw, like every glance was a judgment. Julian stayed by my side, his hand in mine, his quiet strength keeping me grounded. "They'll come around," he said, "or they won't. But you're enough, Elias." We went back to Seattle together, but the weight of New Mexico lingered. I threw myself into my art, painting pieces that bled with everything I'd been holding back: fear, love, grief, hope. Julian was my muse, his presence in every brushstroke, every color. He'd read poetry to me while I worked, his voice weaving stories of resilience and joy. But the world kept testing us. His landlord drama resurfaced, and my freelance gigs dried up. Money was tight, and the stress started to fray the edges of our little utopia. One night, we fought, our first real fight. I was exhausted, snapping at him over something stupid, like dishes in the sink. "You don't get it," I shouted, my voice breaking. "I'm trying to hold it together, and it's not enough." Julian's face softened, but his words were sharp. "You're not the only one struggling, Elias. I'm here too." He walked out, leaving me alone in the apartment that suddenly felt too big. I spent the night sketching, pouring my anger and fear onto the page. By morning, I had a portrait of Julian, his eyes fierce, his mouth soft, his heart laid bare. When he came back, his hair damp from the rain, I showed it to him. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice hoarse. "I'm scared of losing this." He pulled me close, his lips brushing my forehead. "We're not perfect," he whispered, "but we're real." The gallery in Portland called again, offering me a solo show. It was a chance to start over, to build something bigger. But it meant moving, leaving Seattle, leaving the cafe where it all began. Julian and I talked for hours, weighing the risks, the dreams, the unknowns. "I go where you go," he said finally, his hand squeezing mine. "We're in this together." Portland was a fresh start, but it wasn't easy. The city was vibrant, full of artists and dreamers, but it came with its own challenges. Our new apartment was smaller, the rent higher, and Julian struggled to find a steady job. I poured everything into the gallery show, painting late into the night, My canvas is a map of our journey. Rain-soaked cafes, desert stars, Julian's steady hand in mine. The show was a hit, and for the first time, I felt like I was building something real, something lasting. But success didn't erase the doubts. I still woke up some nights, my heart racing, wondering if I was enough. For Julian, for myself, for the world that still judged us. He'd pull me close, his voice a quiet anchor. "You're more than enough," he'd say, and I'd believe him, if only for a moment. We were learning each other, flaws and all, and it was messy, beautiful, human. One evening, as we walked along the Willamette River, the city lights reflecting on the water, Julian stopped and pulled me close. "I wrote something for you," he said, handing me a folded piece of paper. It was a poem, raw and unpolished, about two men finding home in each other's arms. At the bottom, in his messy scrawl, he'd written, "To Elias, my heart, my home." I kissed him there, under the stars, not caring who saw. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a promise, a vow to keep choosing each other, no matter what. Life didn't get easier, but it got fuller. Julian found a job at a bookstore, his poetry gaining traction in local slams. I kept painting, my work finding its way into galleries across the Pacific Northwest. We fought, we laughed, we cried, but we never stopped holding on. Rosa visited us in Portland, her pride in me a quiet strength. She and Julian bonded over bad coffee and worse puns, and for the first time, I felt whole, my past and present finally at peace. Years later, at another rainy cafe, I proposed to Julian. Not with a ring, but with a painting, a canvas of that first night at the Nook, his hand on mine, the rain falling outside. He said yes, tears in his eyes, and we kissed, soft and sure, like that first time. The road hadn't been easy, but it led us here, to a love that was worth every fight, every fear, every moment of vulnerability. That kiss, the one when I was sick and vulnerable, was the spark that changed everything. It wasn't just a touch, it was a beginning, a challenge, a call to be brave. And I haven't stopped thinking about it since, because it reminded me that love, real love, is worth the risk. It's worth the mess. It's worth everything.